The movie starts in Buffalo, where Dan shines as a top car salesman. He's so good at understanding customers that he keeps winning Salesman of the Month.
Again.
Meanwhile, his eccentric coworker Hal makes a flashy arrival at the dealership, driving recklessly and comparing cars and women to speed,
Cars like chicks, or hey, they want to go fast.
much to the team's disapproval. Dan leaves work early to celebrate his wedding anniversary, clearly valuing his peaceful suburban life with his wife Jessica and their 3 kids, Nina, Kyle, and Max. Nina, the oldest, plans to follow her boyfriend to Iowa, switching her college major and giving up her journalism dreams, which frustrates her parents.
What happened to journalism at Stanford? Wasn't that the dream?
Kyle, struggling to connect with Dan, spends time at his friend Samir's house, despite his dad's disapproval of gaming. When Dan scolds him about babysitting responsibilities, Kyle protests. "You made me quit gaming to make friends," he argues.
Quit gaming so I'd make...
But Dan fires back, "I made you quit gaming because blowing people's heads off all day isn't healthy."
Quit gaming because blowing people's heads off 24/7 isn't exactly.
Ultimately, Nina reluctantly agrees to babysit, suspecting Kyle's real motive is to play games at Samir's. At Samir's house, Kyle pays $200 for access to a gaming setup in the garage. Unbeknownst to his family, Kyle is secretly a rising gaming streamer known as Killboy. Meanwhile, Dan and Jessica celebrate their anniversary at a carnival. While in line for a roller coaster, some young guys watching Killboy's stream let them cut ahead, praising the gamer. But Jessica, though fond of their routine, longs for something more exciting. After a thrilling ride, Dan promises to shake things up in their outings. Their evening takes a turn when a stranger rudely snaps a photo of them. Dan confronts him, asking him to delete it, but the man mocks him and posts it online, calling Dan a loser. The situation escalates when the man spills his drink on Dan and insults Jessica. Although furious, Dan walks away, refusing to resort to violence. On the way home, Jessica assures Dan she didn't want him to fight but secretly feels disappointed. Later that night, Dan regrets not standing up to the bully. Jessica, amused by his frustration, jokes that he totally could have taken him. The next day, Jessica attends a kickboxing class and bonds with a woman named Gwen, who shares her own struggles. After accidentally punching Gwen in the face, they bond over smoothies. Jessica admits feeling trapped by Dan's contentment with their ordinary life. Gwen, a travel agent, leaves her card, hinting at an escape. While shopping with Max, Dan notices a suspicious man watching him. When the man lunges, Dan swiftly neutralizes him, shocking bystanders. At home, Dan discovers a hidden stash of guns, cash, and fake passports. Later, he dials a number. On the other end is Augie, a man from Dan's old life. Their conversation is tense and brief. Augie confirms Dan's worst fear, McCaffrey, his ruthless former employer, has found him. Augie advises him to disappear immediately. "Take your family and go," he warns. Dan's mind races. Jessica and the kids have no idea who he really is, and the thought of uprooting their lives fills him with dread. The next morning, Dan makes a decision. He tells Jessica they're going on a spontaneous road trip to Las Vegas. Jessica is surprised but excited, thinking it's a much-needed family getaway. Nina and Kyle grumble about leaving their routines, while Max is thrilled about the adventure. As they pack up the minivan, Dan keeps a close eye on the street, scanning for any signs of danger. As the family heads out of Buffalo, Dan notices a black SUV trailing them at a distance. Trying not to alarm Jessica, he makes casual conversation while keeping one eye on the rearview mirror. Some time later he stops at his workplace. He takes the opportunity to inspect their vehicle. Crawling under the minivan, he finds a GPS tracker discreetly attached to the undercarriage. His heart pounds as he removes it, tossing it into a passing truck to mislead their pursuers. Back on the road, Dan's demeanor grows more serious. Jessica notices but doesn't press him, chalking it up to work stress. The kids are oblivious, too busy with their gadgets and games to notice the tension in their father's eyes. Dan knows they're not out of the woods yet, but for now, they have a small lead. By the time they reach Iowa City, the family is exhausted. Nina, seizing the chance, begs to visit Southern Iowa University, where her boyfriend Trevor studies. Reluctantly, Dan agrees, thinking it might help maintain the illusion of a normal trip. The campus is lively, with students milling about and events happening at every corner. Jessica and Kyle explore the library, while Nina eagerly drags Max along for a tour. Dan, however, remains on high alert. He notices a man speaking German on his phone and feels a wave of unease. He follows the man discreetly, convinced he's connected to McCaffrey. Suddenly, another man attacks attacks Dan, catching him off guard. The fight spills into a chemistry lab, where Dan uses his surroundings to his advantage. Beakers and chairs become weapons as he fends off his attacker, eventually knocking him unconscious. Dan quickly escapes, rejoining his family before they notice his absence. While Dan battles his demons, Nina faces heartbreak of her own. During the campus tour, she sneaks away to surprise Trevor at his dorm. Her excitement turns to devastation when she finds him with another girl. Fighting back tears, she storms out, her dreams of a future with him shattered. When she tells Dan what happened, he comforts her in his own way, teaching her a few self-defense moves. He reminds her of her strength. Later, when Trevor approaches to apologize, Nina decides to put her newfound skills to use. With a swift punch, she leaves him stunned and speechless. Dan watches from a distance, a proud smile on his face. Jessica, however, isn't as amused, scolding Dan for encouraging violence. Despite the drama, the incident brings the family closer, a small silver lining in an otherwise tense journey. As the Morgans drive toward Las Vegas, the tension begins to ease. The kids joke around, Jessica hums along to the radio, and even Dan manages to crack a smile. For a brief moment, it feels like a normal family road trip. But beneath the surface, Dan remains vigilant, scanning the road for any signs of danger. At night, they stop at a roadside motel. While the family sleeps, Dan stays up, keeping watch. Jessica wakes up and joins him, sensing his unease. "What's going on?" she asks softly. Dan hesitates but brushes her off, promising to explain everything once they reach Vegas. Jessica doesn't push him, but the growing distance between them weighs heavily on her heart. As they approach Las Vegas, the bright lights of the city offer a momentary distraction from their troubles. The kids marvel at the sights, while Jessica plans a romantic dinner for her and Dan. She hopes it'll give them a chance to reconnect. Dan agrees, knowing it's time to come clean about his past. That evening, while the kids explore the strip, Dan and Jessica share a quiet dinner. Just as Dan begins to explain, their suite is ambushed by McCaffrey's men. Dan springs into action, using everything in his arsenal to protect Jessica. The fight is brutal and chaotic, but Dan emerges victorious. Jessica, shaken, demands answers. Finally, Dan reveals the truth. His real name is Sean, and he used to work for McCaffrey as an enforcer. Jessica is furious but has little time to process as the danger escalates. Jessica stares at Dan, Sean, as he now calls himself, with a mix of shock and betrayal. Everything she thought she knew about her husband has been a lie. As Dan explains his past with McCaffrey, Jessica's anger gives way to fear. McCaffrey is no ordinary employer. He's a ruthless crime lord who doesn't tolerate betrayal. Dan recounts how he faked his death and started a new life, vowing never to return to his old ways. Jessica's world crumbles as she processes the revelation. But the urgency of their situation forces her to put her emotions aside. Dan hands her and the kids new passports and IDs, instructing them to leave without him. "You'll be safer if I'm not around," he says. Jessica refuses, insisting they face this together. Reluctantly, Dan agrees, knowing they have little time to argue. The next morning, Jessica's best friend, Gwen, arrives in a private jet to take the family back to Buffalo. Dan is suspicious but keeps his thoughts to himself. As the Morgans board the plane, Dan feels a growing sense of unease. His instincts prove correct when Gwen reveals she's working for McCaffrey. She holds Jessica and the kids hostage, demanding Dan return to McCaffrey and fulfill his obligations. Dan reluctantly agrees, his heart breaking as he watches his family taken away. As Gwen and her men prepare to depart, Dan uses his skills to escape, taking down several guards in the process. He contacts Augie for help, but their conversation is cut short when McCaffrey's forces storm the hotel lobby. Dan faces off against McCaffrey's mercenaries in a high-octane battle that turns the hotel into a war zone. Using his intimate knowledge of combat and strategy, Dan outmaneuvers his enemies, taking them down one by one. Dan's singular focus is to rescue his family, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Jessica and the kids are locked in a room with Gwen. Jessica uses her wits to create a distraction, allowing Kyle to hack into the plane's systems. Nina and Max help by sabotaging the guards' equipment, proving that the Morgans are far from ordinary. Back in the hotel, Jessica manages to outsmart Gwen, using a shard of broken glass to free herself and her kids. In a tense showdown, Jessica channels her inner strength, using a piece of broken bamboo as a makeshift weapon. With a swift throw, she impales Gwen through the chest, ending her betrayal once and for all. Jessica's victory is short-lived as McCaffrey himself enters the room. His cold demeanor sends chills down her spine, but before he can act, Dan bursts in, guns blazing. The two men engage in a brutal fight, their years of history fueling every punch. The fight between Dan and McCaffrey is intense and personal. McCaffrey taunts Dan, accusing him of weakness for choosing family over power. Dan counters with a fierce determination, fueled by his love for Jessica and the kids. The battle takes them through the hotel's rooftop, where Dan finally gains the upper hand. With one final blow, he knocks McCaffrey unconscious, ending the nightmare once and for all. With McCaffrey defeated, the Morgans return to Buffalo, eager to rebuild their lives. Dan, now fully embracing his identity as Sean, opens a security consulting firm, using his skills to help others protect themselves. Jessica channels her newfound strength into coaching high school track and field, inspiring young athletes to reach their potential. The Morgans prepare for a cross-country road trip to drop Nina off at Stanford. The RV is packed with supplies, and the family is excited about the adventure ahead. Dan reflects on how much has changed, grateful for a second chance to be the husband and father he wants to be. The journey to Stanford is filled with laughter, arguments, and moments of reflection. If you loved this thrilling recap, be sure to stick around for more exciting stories.